Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, I'm taking you behind the scenes of my thinking process as I prepare material for my upcoming personality disorders class. I want to walk you through how I actually reason clinically when I'm trying to differentiate between borderline and narcissistic dynamics, especially in moments where the behavior can look deceptively similar. I'm starting with a small, ordinary-looking scene. Someone sitting quietly on the couch, disengaged, withdrawn. And the question I found myself asking, is he shutting down? But what does that shutdown mean? And what was happening inside of him at that moment? This is actually a very important diagnostic question because shutdown, withdrawal, and protest can show up in both narcissistic and borderline organizations. On the surface, they can look nearly identical. But the inner logic, the emotional meaning to the shutdown, the function of the behavior, and most importantly, what happens next is very different. So in this episode, I'm going to compare and contrast how this exact same behavior operates in narcissistic versus borderline personality organization. We'll look at what's driving it, what the person is protecting against, and how to tell whether we're looking at narcissistic injury or borderline rage and decompensation. And by the end, I hope you'll have a clearer psychodynamic way of answering the question that comes up so often in real life. Is this NPD or BPD? Or, as I would prefer to say, are we looking at narcissistic or borderline dynamics? And if you're listening because you see yourself in these moments, if you've noticed yourself going quiet, pulling back, or shutting down in relationships and wondering what's actually happening inside of you, this episode is for you too. By the end, I hope you'll have a clearer way of understanding your own reactions. That kind of understanding is often the first step toward more choice in how you're going to respond in these moments, and then therefore more control over what happens next. Let's get right into it. So, let's set the stage. Imagine a husband whose in-laws are visiting for the weekend. His wife is busy. She's hosting. She's coordinating. She's emotionally attuned to her parents. Her attention is pulled elsewhere. Nothing dramatic is happening. No argument, no obvious rupture. But he starts to fade out. He's not very interested in helping her or helping with the kids. He's distant. He ends up sitting on the couch, scrolling, half present. Not fully gone, but not really there either. From the outside, it looks like disengagement, maybe even avoidance. But clinically, that's not the question I'm interested in. The question is, what is that withdrawal doing for him in that moment? What led up to the withdrawal? And does he have the capacity to step back and reflect on what really happened? So already just that in and of itself, being able to step back and think is already a diagnostic indicator whether we're looking at more narcissistic or borderline organization. And this is where diagnosis can easily go wrong. If you only stay focused on the behavior, that's the withdrawal, the shutdown, the pulling away, you'll miss what actually distinguishes one personality organization from another. Both narcissistic and borderline organizations can show and have shared surface features. Both organizations, what do we see? We can see intensive reactivity to loss of attention. So that's one thing they both show. As this moment is explored, though, he can say, in this example that I'm giving you, that he no longer felt special. His wife's attention shifted away, and suddenly he was expected to give his full attention to the kids, right at the moment when he wanted attention. What stands out is the abrupt loss of centrality that precedes his shutdown. Also, both can show withdrawal following perceived relational injury. The injury here isn't a fight or an explicit rejection. It's quieter. No longer being the center of his wife's attention and feeling left alone. That was the shift right there. And both can show difficulty tolerating thirdness. Thirdness is any rival. It's any other. It doesn't even have to be a person, by the way. It could be a job. It could be a hobby. In this case, the in-laws function as the third. a competing other that absorbs attention and reorganizes the relational field. And finally, both of them have indirect expression of anger rather than verbal articulation. So both of them, right? We could see that, well, let me just stay with this example. This anger is largely outside of his conscious awareness. Like, we don't see him getting angry in that example of him sitting on the couch withdrawn. He presents more as what? Deflated and disengaged rather than angry. But you can hear it in his complaints, in the resistance to taking care of the kids, in the retreat to the couch. This is what we call passive aggressive. So the anger comes out, it seeps out in a passive way, a quiet pulling back of vitality and punishing his wife. In other words, he's leaving her alone because he felt that she left him alone. So now she's on her own with the kids and the in-laws, so she's juggling everything. What I'm emphasizing is the shutdown in and of itself is not diagnostic. The intensity and subjective meaning of the shutdown is. So let's keep going and try to understand this behavior. And by the way, we're talking about an emotional shutdown, which may also look like an emotional collapse. And I put that in your mind because we're trying to figure out, how would this be different? What looks different? What feels different? In terms of distinguishing between NPD and BPD. So let's look at now his core experience. This is now getting into the inner logic. The shutdown here appears to be primarily a response to a narcissistic injury, a collapse of being central, admired, or uniquely chosen. But what's the function of the shutdown? The shutdown functions and acts as withholding, that's what I just mentioned a moment ago in the passive aggressiveness, rather than him feeling completely abandoned. In other words, the inner logic is, if I'm not special, I will not give my vitality. In other words, I'm not going to be alive. I'm not going to be present unless I am the center of attention. This is an angry disengagement, not panic. And I'm saying that, I'm planting a seed for you to think about this, because panic, in contrast to the angry disengagement experienced here, is typically a more visceral, dysregulated response to perceived abandonment or threat. It often involves heightened arousal, fear of annihilation, I have to come back to that word, and a desperate need for reassurance or containment. This kind of collapse is more characteristic of borderline organization, where the shutdown is driven by intense anxiety and fear of being left alone, uncontained, rather than by anger over a loss of centrality or a narcissistic injury. So let's go over annihilation because it's so important, and you often hear this in social media. The way that I'm using that concept is there's an overwhelming fear that one's sense of self or one's existence is at risk of being destroyed. So what does that actually mean? Behaviorally, like if we look at the behavior that we would see on the surface, what you would see is intense panic, terror, desperation, feelings of being, empty inside. And actually, I shouldn't even say these are behaviors. Let me correct that. These are inner experiences because we're talking about what's at the core. But if we look at the behavior, what we actually see are frantic efforts to seek reassurance, to cling or control others, to maybe they're going to engage in self-harm, to feel affectively alive again, especially if they're feeling annihilated and dead or empty inside. There may be intense self-harm. So what's the psychodynamic meaning of all this? It reflects a collapse of psychic structures that normally contain and regulate feelings, intense feelings. That's the ability, what that means is the ability to soothe oneself and the ability to think instead of act on the feelings, like I was just describing in the behaviors. With the borderline organization, you see more acting rather than reflecting. So when there's this collapse of psychic structure, again, the ability to soothe oneself and think, this often triggers regression to what we call primitive defenses. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I just mean that these are early defenses that get developed in childhood. And these defenses distort reality more than what we consider mature defenses, which are more adaptive. So this triggers regression to primitive defenses such as what? Splitting, projection, projective identification, denial, idealization, and devaluation. Those are a few of the most primitive, or let's just call them early level, most reality distorting defenses that get pulled upon. But now we have to think about containment, because containment allows for a self to feel safe, but they don't feel safe. That when there's this kind of collapse in the psychic structure, there's a feeling of like, I feel scared, right? But if there's not a complete collapse, they could say to themselves, but I'm still me. Or they can say, this hurts, but it will pass. And by the way, that's one of the interventions. One of the things that patients have found very helpful that I use is we begin to look at, yes, this is a very intense feeling, but just yesterday, your wife was there with you. And will she not be there with you again once the in-laws leave? In borderline organization, distress reflects a failure of containment. So you lose this capacity to comfort, reassure yourself, to evoke a memory. So what we see is panic, fear of annihilation. Again, that's the falling apart. And then movement very quickly into a dysregulated state. Emotions go up. Thinking and reflecting goes down. In narcissistic organization, these structures remain more intact. For those of you who have been following along, you know I constantly talk about the grandiose sense of self. That's the main structure that holds the narcissist together. And one of the differentiating qualities when we're thinking about NPD or these characteristics, these borderline versus narcissistic characteristics. Okay, let's go back to the core experience of the withdrawal, sitting on the couch. What is the relationship to others? So we're going through all the different things that I'm assessing as I hear this story. Others are experienced as failing to mirror him. Remember, he lost his wife's attention. The rivalry is central. Remember, those are the in-laws, or a job, or your wife going out with her friends. That's the third that I mentioned. The distress centers on loss of specialness and centrality. So there's the distress right there, that you are no longer the center of attention. You no longer feel special, acknowledged, recognized. In contrast, in borderline organization, the core response is less about rivalry and more about fear of abandonment. And not even fear, but let me say complete abandonment or loss of that emotional containment that I mentioned a moment ago. The presence of a third is experienced not as competition, but as evidence of being left, replaced, or erased, often triggering what? Panic, and then that clinging, that desperation, or emotional collapse that I mentioned earlier, rather than what we see in the more narcissistic organization, that angry withdrawal. So I hope you're beginning to get a sense, like qualitatively, this feels very different.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. Now, in the more borderline organization, others are called upon and are needed as external regulators. And the feelings are different too. Like with this fellow, we do see anger. We do see envy at the in-laws. We do see resentment. And of course, shame is present as well, but it's covered by the control of the withdrawal. So you don't see shame on the surface. There's no overt or catastrophic fear of falling apart. You don't hear that in his story. You don't hear annihilation anxiety or intense abandonment. In contrast, in borderline organization, rage would be more explosive and the whole situation would unfold in a much more chaotic way. There would be far less capacity to hold the anger without acting it out. And you would experience, again, I referred to this in the prior episode, an affect storm, something I mentioned earlier, and I went into far more detail, but you could go back and check that out. But that's when things really start to get chaotic because you cannot control your affective experience. Finally, in terms of the core experience, let's think about the ego organization. Identity remains cohesive. Affect is regulated, again, through defensive control. Reality testing remains more or less intact. In other words, his in-laws are not plotting against him so they could spend more time with his wife. But in contrast, with the borderline organization, identity is unstable and fragmented. This is often what we call identity diffusion. What this would look like just very practically. What kind of wife is she? See, that's where he begins to lose a sense of himself and of others. What kind of wife is she? Or what kind of husband am I? And all that begins, his whole identity begins to be called into question. And therefore, reality testing becomes compromised under these stressful situations with rapid, again, those early level defenses that I mentioned earlier, with splitting and projection and projective identification. And things become very concrete as well. So that's part of the reality testing being lost. In other words, what that means is that experiences and perceptions quickly become absolute and literal. Again, I know I referred to this in an earlier episode, but that's the literal mode versus the representational mode of functioning. Others are experienced as, here's the splitting, all good, all bad. Either you're with me or you're against me. My wife was with me yesterday, but now she's against me. And the in-laws are against me too. There's a subjective feeling. The feelings are what? The feelings are treated as objective facts rather than internal states that could be reflected upon. See, that's the loss of reality testing. That's the loss of the capacity to think that I mentioned earlier. So in this example, this fellow was able to talk and recognize a feeling of exclusion, not being the center of his wife's attention. And he didn't remain rooted in his own reality and just remain angry and blame her and talk about how he's being attacked and look what she's doing to me and look what the in-laws did to me and so on. With borderline organization, you get a more urgent sense of this kind of rigidity, this fixed way of thinking about their own reality. There's no movement there. And there's an urgent sense of collapse. There's imminent danger. And you get a feeling when you're with somebody like this that you really have to hold this person together. They get this feeling too, like, I need to be held, or you feel like I need to hold them, or they'll fall apart. And by the way, sometimes you do see this with suicidal threats or gestures or severely dangerous behaviors that they engage in. They engage in extremely risky behaviors. This emerges here at this moment, not as manipulation in the usual sense, but as a desperate attempt to communicate unbearable psychic pain. That's the collapse of the psychic structure, again, that I mentioned earlier. And it's their bid to secure immediate containment when these internal structures have failed them. And they can get attainment because if there's a suicidal gesture or risky behavior, someone may take more of an interest in doing what? Being there for them, holding them. Now, with the narcissistic organization, the intervention often aims to what? To do what? We're going to name the injury and make the withdrawal, the retreat to the couch, more thinkable. So in other words, that we can begin to think about this together without shaming it or confronting it too directly. So an example of this may be something like this. It seems like when you no longer felt central or important in that moment, something in you pulled back, almost as if staying engaged would have meant tolerating a feeling of being unimportant or overlooked. Now, if this appears to be more borderline in nature, the intervention shifts toward, I keep mentioning this, but this is so important, containment and stabilization. So the goal is to stabilize somebody like that. In a way, they're very similar because we still want to slow it down. And I would say, let's slow this down for a moment. We're here. We have time. And we can hold this together. Let's go back. Let's go over it again, step by step. I really want to understand what happened when, and then here you can fill in the blank, but we go back to the moment where they begin to have a feeling of whatever it may have been, of dysregulation, emotions start to get heightened. That's what we want to get back to. What does this say psychodynamically? What I'm saying is, in my work with these individuals that I have to temporarily lend them my ego. In other words, they borrow my ego. This is what I called an ego supportive approach in a prior episode. So my ego can replace those internal structures that have collapsed. So now there's an external organization temporarily that I become the thinking function. I help them re-engage by way of doing it with them, a reflective capacity, which gets them into a more regulated state of mind. I become the timekeeper. Remember I said, let's go back. Take a moment. Think about it. When did you first start feeling this way? So I become the container because that psychic structure is no longer containing them. You are effectively saying, I will hold the structure until you can take it back. That's what you're saying. If you're with somebody that you know or someone close to you who decompensates in this way, you're not saying this literally, but that's the message that you're giving them, that I'm going to hold this. And I trust that together we'll figure this out, and then your structures, your capacity for reflection will come back online, which, by the way, typically happens once they get reconstituted. In a borderline configuration, the response would look very different. Rather than withdrawing quietly, this guy would cling, pursue, or position his wife to take care of him. There's some sort of or some form of crisis that's designed, either consciously or unconsciously, to secure immediate attention and containment, a sudden medical issue, incapacitating pain, a migraine headache, or an emotional collapse that requires caretaking. He would not just be sitting quietly on the couch. That image alone is distinctly on borderline, if I'm making that clear. Another important indicator of borderline organization emerges after the attention is secured. When the care is offered, when the partner steps in to regulate, soothe, or stabilize, like I was just describing with the act of containment, he may become critical, rejecting, or push the caregiver away. The very person he urgently needed moments earlier now feels intrusive, inadequate, or suffocating. This reflects the core, again, what we call in my field, this is the need, I'm quoting it, the need-fear dilemma that's very common in borderline organization. But that's a story for another day. I'm going to go into that in more detail. That's a whole episode on its own. Now that we've explored how affect and identity show up differently in narcissistic versus borderline patterns, let's pause and review what we've covered and why it really matters. The crucial point is in the micro moment, the split second before anger, panic, disintegration, dysregulation, and withdrawal takes over. It's in the moment that support, whether from yourself, a partner, or a therapist, can make the biggest difference. Stabilizing a fragile sense of self, restoring internal structure, and preventing escalation. The focus here isn't on analyzing or processing every feeling right away, but on noticing early signals, offering containment, and helping restore some kind of inner balance. Asking yourself, or guiding someone, what was the very first sign? Not the anger, but the moment that I started to feel unimportant. This allows reflection before action. By the time anger or panic is fully expressed, thinking is gone. You're already in that dysregulated state. Something has already happened. Catching it early shifts the task from reacting or acting out to reflecting and restoring a certain balance. At this stage, an ego-supportive approach matters. That was me, what I mentioned earlier, lending my ego, reflecting, thinking, slowing things down, lending structure to a collapsing internal system, holding space, pacing the moment, and offering containment. This is what helps someone regain internal regulation before emotional processing can take place. And by the way, I just want to remind you, this is one perspective. If you stay tuned, I'm going to go into other perspectives, other theoretical positions, or other theories on how we help somebody in this moment. Finally, if you're listening and recognizing this in yourself, feeling panic, the urge to cling, or there's a feeling of desperation or even of falling apart, just noticing these early moments and taking steps to steady yourself is actually the first step toward reclaiming control over your inner emotional state. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.